June 26, 1943. Somewhere over northern France, 48 American P-47 Thunderbolts are escorting B-17s home from a raid on an airfield near Paris, when 16 German Focke-Wulf 190s dive out of the sun. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying at the rear of his squadron, takes the worst of it. A German cannon shell shreds his canopy. 21 20mm shells and more than 200 machine gun rounds tear into his fuselage. Shrapnel opens his leg. A bullet grazes the tip of his nose. His airplane catches fire and falls out of formation in a spiraling, uncontrolled dive that should end, by any reasonable expectation, in a dead pilot and a smoking crater somewhere in the French countryside. It does not. Johnson kicks the rudder, hauls the stick back, and somehow wrestles the burning Thunderbolt level. Behind him, a German fighter closes for what should be the finishing pass, and simply cannot finish it, because the pilot has run out of ammunition. He pulls alongside instead, rocks his wings in a salute to a machine that has just refused to die, and turns for home. Johnson flies his shredded, smoking P-47 back across the channel and lands it. He would fly again within weeks. Ground crews who inspected the wreckage afterward reportedly struggled to understand how the airplane had stayed in one piece, let alone flown a return leg across open water, with an engine that had absorbed damage no design document had ever promised it could survive. Pause on that. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the airplane that earned a reputation on both sides of the front line. American pilots trusted it to bring them home from damage that should have killed them, and German troops on the ground came to dread the sound of it overhead. Some of what built that reputation is exactly as documented as it sounds. Some of it, as you'll see, has picked up a little embellishment along the way, and this channel owes you the honest version of both. Part 1. An interceptor that outgrew itself. The P-47 began as a much smaller idea than what eventually flew into combat. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, had been working on a lightweight interceptor concept before the specifications shifted towards something far heavier. A fighter built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an air-cooled radial engine paired with a turbo supercharger for high-altitude performance. That single engineering choice, air-cooled rather than liquid-cooled, turned out to matter enormously later in the airplane's story, for reasons that had nothing to do with speed or altitude, and everything to do with what happened when the engine actually took a bullet. By the time production aircraft reached squadrons, the Thunderbolt had grown into the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war. A fully loaded combat weight pushing close to 8 tons, armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, and capable of diving faster than nearly anything else in the sky. Kartveli's team had originally sketched something closer to a lightweight, cannon-armed point defense interceptor, in line with a lot of early war fighter thinking that prized climb rate and agility above all else. The decision to instead build around a massive radial engine and a turbo supercharger system large enough to require its own ducting through the fuselage changed the airplane's entire character. Early pilots transitioning from smaller fighters found the Thunderbolt intimidatingly large in the cockpit, and initial skepticism about whether something this heavy could actually dogfight effectively took real combat experience to overcome. It could not outturn the nimbler German and Japanese fighters it would eventually face. What it could do was absorb an extraordinary amount of punishment, dive away from almost any pursuer, and hit as hard as any fighter in the theater once it got into position. Part 2. The Jug. 2 different ways. Pilots and ground crews nicknamed it the Jug almost immediately, and the explanation you'll hear most often is that it stood for Juggernaut, a fitting tribute to an airplane built like a tank with wings. It's a good story, and wartime public relations happily ran with it. The more carefully researched explanation is less dramatic. The Thunderbolt's thick, bottle-shaped fuselage simply reminded ground crews of an ordinary glass milk jug of the era, the kind sitting on any American kitchen counter. Neither origin comes with ironclad documentation, but historians who have actually dug into it tend to treat the milk jug explanation as the more probable one, and the Juggernaut story as folk etymology that stuck because it flattered the airplane. It's a small correction, but it's the kind this channel exists to make. Even the origin of a nickname deserves better than the version that just sounds better. There is a third explanation floating around in less formal accounts, one holding that the nickname referred to a container for homemade whiskey rather than milk, a reminder that wartime slang rarely comes with a single tidy citation, and that multiple explanations can circulate simultaneously among men who mostly cared about winning the war, not documenting their own vocabulary for historians 80 years later. What all three explanations agree on is the shape driving the name, something round, bottle-bodied, and unmistakably solid, which was, whatever you called it, a fair description of the airplane itself. Part 3. The Flight That Built the Legend. Robert Johnson's June 26, 1943 mission is the single most cited example of the Thunderbolt's toughness, and unlike the nickname story, this one holds up under scrutiny. Johnson himself later gave the precise count: 21 20mm cannon shells and more than 200 7.92mm machine gun rounds struck his aircraft in that engagement. He suffered burns and shrapnel wounds and very nearly lost control of a burning airplane spinning toward the ground, and he still managed to fly it home and land it under his own power. The engine that kept running through all of that was the same air-cooled radial that had seemed, on paper, like a less elegant engineering choice than the liquid-cooled inline engines powering the Spitfire, the Mustang, or the German fighters Johnson was fighting that day. A liquid-cooled engine with a punctured coolant line seizes up within minutes. An air-cooled radial can lose a cylinder, take serious damage, and often keep turning anyway. Johnson's flight is, in a very real sense, that engineering trade-off proven in the most dramatic possible circumstances. Johnson's own account of the mission, given years later, described watching tracers walk across his wings and fuselage and genuinely expecting the airplane to come apart around him before he ever got the chance to fight back. The fire that broke out in the cockpit area burned his hands and face badly enough that he needed real medical attention on landing. And by his own telling, part of what kept him conscious and functioning through the worst of the dive was simple determination not to die over occupied France, with the war barely half fought. That combination, a genuinely brutal beating and a pilot who refused to stop flying the airplane, is exactly the kind of story that turns into a squadron legend within days, and the Thunderbolt's reputation for toughness spread through 8th Air Force fighter groups, largely because stories like this one kept happening, not because a single flight proved anything on its own. Part 4. The German pilot nobody can confirm. Here is where the story needs its second honest correction. Popular retellings of Johnson's flight, including some well-known published accounts, identify the German pilot who ran out of ammunition and saluted him as Egon Mayer, a genuine Luftwaffe ace, and the commander of a fighter group who had helped pioneer head-on attack tactics against American bombers. It's a satisfying detail. A named, decorated enemy ace personally witnessing the Thunderbolt's toughness and paying tribute to it. But other historians who have gone back through unit records and loss reports for that specific engagement have raised real doubts about whether Mayer was actually the pilot involved, suggesting the identification may be closer to an accepted legend than a documented fact. The core event, a German fighter running dry on ammunition and rocking its wings before departing, is not in serious dispute. Exactly which German pilot did it is far less certain than the more popular versions of this story let on. This is a pattern worth recognizing whenever a wartime story reaches you with a named enemy ace attached to a dramatic moment. The more specific and cinematic a detail sounds, the more it tends to owe to a good storyteller somewhere along the chain of retellings, rather than to a verified unit log. None of this means Johnson's account of his own aircraft's condition should be doubted. His description of the damage matches independent squadron records for that mission. It means the added flourish of exactly whose cockpit that salute came from deserves the same skepticism this channel applies to every other too perfect detail in a war full of them. Part 5. From Escort to Executioner. By 1944, the Thunderbolt's role in the war was changing. As the P-51 Mustang took over the long-range bomber escort mission this channel has already told you about, most Thunderbolt groups shifted toward the U.S. 9th Air Force's tactical fighter bomber campaign over France, hunting German armor, trains, and supply columns in direct support of Allied ground troops. This was where the airplane's brute durability translated into something ground crews and infantry could see for themselves. A Thunderbolt diving through flak to strafe a column, absorbing hits that would have downed a lighter aircraft, and climbing back out to do it again. Republic and the Army Air Forces leaned into this shift, equipping later Thunderbolt variants with underwing racks capable of carrying bombs and rockets, in addition to the standard machine gun armament, turning an airplane originally conceived as a high-altitude interceptor into one of the most effective mobile artillery pieces the Allies had, one that could relocate to a new target faster than any towed gun battery and hit with a precision no indirect fire mission could match. German troops on the receiving end of these attacks developed a generic term for any Allied fighter bomber overhead: Jabo, short for Jag bomber, and the shouted warning Jabo became one of the most feared sounds on the Western Front battlefield in 1944. Accounts from German veterans describe the warning cry spreading down a column within seconds of the first spotter catching sight of an incoming aircraft. Soldiers scattering for whatever cover the terrain offered. Drivers abandoning trucks in the open road rather than risk being caught inside a vehicle when the strafing run began. It was, by the testimony of the men who lived through it, one of the defining sounds of the campaign in France and Germany during the war's final year, on par with artillery barrages in the dread it produced among frontline troops who had learned exactly how little warning they typically got. It's worth being precise here. Jabo was not a nickname coined specifically for the P-47. German soldiers used it for Mustangs, Typhoons, and any other Allied fighter bomber that might appear overhead. What made the P-47 disproportionately responsible for that fear through much of the campaign was simple math. It was, for long stretches of 1944, the most numerous fighter bomber the 9th Air Force had in the air over the front, which meant that in practice, a great many of the Jabo attacks German troops were bracing for were Thunderbolts specifically, even if the word itself belonged to the whole category of aircraft. These missions rarely made for the kind of dramatic newsreel footage that fighter versus fighter combat produced. They were low, fast, dangerous passes through concentrated small arms and flak fire, deliberately positioned to defend exactly the kind of column or rail junction a Thunderbolt pilot was trying to hit. Losses on these missions were real and steady, a grinding attrition very different from the high-altitude escort battles this channel has covered in other episodes. And the pilots who flew them rarely returned home to write best-selling memoirs the way some of the era's top aces did. Their war was measured in trucks destroyed and rail lines cut rather than aerial victories, and it left a mark on the German army's ability to move and supply itself that mattered just as much to the war's outcome, even if it produced far less glamorous footage. Part 6. The Bulge. The Thunderbolt's ground attack reputation reached its sharpest point during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when a German offensive through the Ardennes forest caught Allied forces by surprise and thick winter cloud cover grounded Allied air support for days at a stretch, leaving encircled American troops at Bastion and elsewhere without the close air cover that had become routine that year. When the weather finally broke around Christmas, P-47s were among the first aircraft back in the fight, tearing into the German columns and armor that had advanced under cover of the overcast. Pilots and infantry alike came to treat the sudden appearance of Thunderbolts overhead, after days of being unable to count on any air cover at all, as one of the campaign's genuine turning points. Not because any single mission won the battle outright, but because the return of air power reintroduced a threat German commanders had briefly believed the weather had taken off the table. For the American soldiers on the ground at Bastion and along the shoulders of the German advance, the return of clear skies and the Thunderbolts that came with it carried a psychological weight that went beyond whatever tonnage of ordnance actually landed on target. It meant the war's other dimension, the one fought overhead, had come back online after a week of feeling entirely alone against an armored offensive that had already broken through in several places. German commanders, for their part, had built real operational assumptions around several more days of cloud cover, and the sudden return of Allied air power forced hurried, costly adjustments to movement schedules that had been made on the assumption the sky would stay empty a while longer. Part 7. The Group That Never Switched. One fighter group in the European theater flew the Thunderbolt from its earliest combat missions all the way to the end of the war without converting to the Mustang, unlike most of the 8th Air Force's other groups. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded for much of the war by Colonel Hub Zemke and known to history as Zemke's Wolfpack, stayed loyal to the Jug even as squadron after squadron around them traded up for the longer-legged, higher-altitude Mustang. By the war's end, the 56th finished as the top-scoring American fighter group in the European theater of operations, a record built entirely on an airplane most other units had already moved past. Zemke's own reasoning for staying with the Thunderbolt was reportedly practical rather than sentimental. He trusted the airplane's ruggedness and high-altitude performance, and he was skeptical that the Mustang's evident range advantages were worth trading away the Jug's proven survivability, particularly for a group that had already built its tactics and its confidence around the airplane's specific strengths. That confidence was not universally shared. Plenty of pilots in other groups welcomed the switch to the sleeker, longer-ranged Mustang without hesitation, and the overall 8th Air Force did convert most of its fighter groups away from the P-47 as 1944 wore on. The Wolfpack's decision to hold out looks, in hindsight, less like stubbornness and more like a calculated bet on an airplane its pilots had already learned, the hard way, how to trust. It stands as the clearest rebuttal to any suggestion that the Thunderbolt was simply a stopgap the Army Air Forces outgrew. For the pilots who stuck with it, it never stopped being the airplane they trusted most. The Thunderbolt never inherited the cultural fame the Mustang carries today. It doesn't headline the same documentaries, and its silhouette is less instantly recognizable to most people than the sleek lines of the aircraft that eventually took over its escort mission. But ask what airplane German ground troops actually feared seeing overhead through most of 1944, or what airplane a young lieutenant credited with keeping him alive after 21 cannon shells and 200 bullets tore through his fuselage. And the honest answer is the same heavy, radial engine fighter that started life as a lightweight interceptor concept and grew into something that simply refused to go down. Some of its legend needed correcting in this video. None of it needed exaggerating. Robert Johnson finished the war with 27 confirmed aerial victories, all of them scored in Thunderbolts, flying under Hub Zemke's command in the same 56th Fighter Group that never gave the airplane up. He survived the war, wrote and spoke about his experiences for decades afterward, and remained, by every account, genuinely convinced that the specific airplane he happened to be flying on June 26, 1943, was the reason he lived to do any of it. That kind of testimony, from the man who actually sat in the cockpit while 21 cannon shells found their mark, carries a weight no amount of nickname folklore or disputed enemy ace attribution can add to or take away. Subscribe if you want the next chapter in the story of the aircraft history almost forgot.